Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vector, where we discuss topics, trends, and insights driving the global space ecosystem. I am your host, Kelli Kedis Ogborn, and today is all about fostering better international business engagement and really creating frameworks in thinking and quite literally for how to navigate and drive in the intertangled world that is the evolving space economy with its various markets, drivers, facets, and players. Joining me today for this conversation is Rose Croshier, who is an international relations specialist within the Office of Space Commerce, that's part of the U.S. Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. She has a global portfolio where she works to deepen international engagements to promote U.S. space commerce and international commercial space cooperation more broadly. She is also a non-resident fellow with the Center for Global Development and recently published the Handbook for Space Capability Development, which we will link in the comments, and continues her work enabling low and middle income countries' adoption of space-based technologies. Rose, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Kelly. Thrilled to be here. It's a fantastic topic. Obviously, I'm a fan, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
I am too, because you have such an interesting background and broad perspective from the, academic side, fellowship side, the government side now. And I think that the way that you approach international engagement and creating these roadmaps for countries and companies, I think is going to be really, really helpful and critical. And when we talk about this concept of improving frameworks and really bridging the gap is what it is, because as you know, there are so many different countries now that are engaging with space, and I think our last count was about 102. There is a lot of excitement, a lot of opportunity, and as we all know that there's not one path to do it. But the bigger question on people's minds is it's not just national anymore, and there is a real need to be able to bridge this gap and create these inroads for different countries to collaborate. So I want to start off broad and then get a bit more nuanced. And really, the first piece I want to throw out is this concept of a framework, because space means different things for different people. And one of the things that we always talk about at Space Commerce Institute is space needs to make sense for whoever is engaging it. So I want to throw that, level setting vernacular question over, is that when you think about frameworks, what does that actually mean?
Love it. So, framework is a very flexible diplomatic word, right? That people use in many different ways, but I think it's useful. It's a scaffolding essentially because we're trying to string together these incredibly complex system of systems that it takes for the space economy to flourish, both for the U.S. and really for the world. And so if you start kind of talking about those different systems, you've got your international trade relationships, you have the financing landscape, you have the innovation ecosystem that we've talked about in previous episodes. And of course, there's this cultural factor too, which can play into how any particular community understands and deals with risk and how we build trust. So when we say framework in the government sense, we're trying to do as much as we can to make a structure so we can be deliberate
Yeah.
and do what we're best at, and then kind of just set the environment for civil and commercial to operate to do what they're best at. And we start getting into trouble when we cross the lanes necessarily. So that's what I talk about when I say framework. I think the overall goal really is to methodically balance all of these competing demands so that we can, come to a useful solution using a whole raft of tools. So it's kind of like an organizing entity. There's a lot of kind of non-space frameworks that have been going on for years, if not decades, that are starting to bring the space element into it, which I think is really a healthy thing we want. We want our leaders, and we're talking about negotiating trade or diplomacy, whatever it is, to be thinking, cars and trucks and space. It shouldn't be an isolated thing because it still is part of our economy like anything else is.
I love that. And I'm actually glad you brought that into the conversation, because one of the challenges that I've seen is that sometimes when people think about creating a space framework, they think they're starting from scratch, and they're not. Because to your point, there are these existing structures, existing industries that have relevance to space are probably being utilized to prop up the capabilities and development of space, but don't actually think they're part of that ecosystem. And so you even made the point of doing what you're already good at. And so being able to identify what those are and leverage those in, I think will allow people to realize that they're not really starting from ground zero.
Absolutely, absolutely. So really, we're just trying to normalize space in
Right.
our regular work, and I think the Office of Space Commerce is kind of a spokesman for that. When we're an internal advocate, we're trying to bring together, state and defense and all of the sub organizations really underneath that have a space role, but there's not necessarily thinking about it in those terms. So we're trying to sort of organize and focus that type of work. And also, I'll note that my path coming to this position for a while, I did a lot of program design and management, and it was focused more on things like security,
Mhm.
maritime security, or border security, or Ebola. Like big systemic issues. And there were so many components, that took to have a strong program or the result you want to get to. And really, in my work, I ended up just focusing that skill set, on space, and that's where the Handbook for Space Capability came out of. It was really kind of methodical walkthrough. What does it take to develop a capability for an effect that you want? And so I guess I'm basically saying that I agree with you.
No, well, and the handbook too, as I mentioned, we're going to link it in the comments, but I do agree that it very much walks people through the process, and it sort of demystifies, what it means to become part of space, enter space. And I think that kind of practical conversation is really helpful, because I've said this many times, and I probably said this on previous episodes, but part of the problem that space has is that it's still very much seen in mythical, mystic terms, but also people still sometimes talk about it just in statistics and acronyms, and not really those kind of fluid insertion points that people can engage with. And I know a lot of the focus of what you do at Office of Space Commerce is also to invite people to the table to do more business, right? And to have these broader engagements, which certainly is a big task, because different countries operate in different ways in terms of their frameworks, for lack of a better term, regulatory policies, investment structures, culture, all these things that you mentioned. So within your role and within the office, how do you guys approach that? Because the US, from a obviously from a country stature, but also a space stature, is still very much on the minds of a lot of people that want to come and engage in the US space business. And so what is your methodology around that?
So maybe this is why I'm so simpatico with this office, and in the sense that I'm absolutely interested in practical, pragmatic implementation. Like, yeah, the
Mm,
policy sounds great. What does it actually mean on the ground?
yeah.
How
Like,
does this
let's do it.
affect?
Let's do it.
Yeah, what is the thing that we have to do that is going to take advantage of whatever it is? And so really, it's kind of the nature of the Office of Space Commerce. Our goal is to improve the environment broadly. So we're bringing together, we're trying to understand problems, we're trying to understand opportunities. We're trying to put that in real terms, both internally and externally. So we're and it also takes into account the sort of fuzzy aspect you're talking about. Fostering the conditions, the environment. It's really taking into account all of these factors and trying to kind of move forward, not so spread out thinly that we don't have anything measurable, but not too limited, not too locked into like counting components. I mean, we don't measure our success by how many widgets are sold on any given
Right.
day. Another aspect of that is just we're concerned with our industry's growth. It's the advancement of technology and our competitiveness at home and abroad. Just a lot of the things that are good though for U.S. business is broadly good for global space industry. Having transparent rules and policy and regulations is really helps reduce risk, helps reduce friction. Helps us work together and find customers and find partners and find those who have services or goods to provide. So that's the broad picture. One nuance I have to say is the OSC focuses at the systemic level, whereas our sister organization, the International Trade Administration, or ITA, is much more focused on the business to business angle. So they are always a resource as well, and we work in tandem.
That's a helpful caveat and nuance, really, about who's who. And when you engage, or try to engage these other entities, is it more your office is reaching out, or can other countries or companies from other countries engage, and what does that process look like?
Sure, sure, sure. So, we have a website, and there's literally like a link there of like come talk to us, and we really look at that. And so we invite engagement, broadly. So looking at the kind of, day-to-day things that we're doing, we're trying to understand and remove bureaucratic obstacles, like what is the issue that's holding back or slowing down space related business. And then we do a lot of facilitation work between industry and government. So when we're having these more, for example, diplomatic frameworks, it'll be our office that does the, we call it track 1.5, where you have both government and we invite industry to the table, be it bilateral or multilateral, to improve sort of that exchange of information and really inject energy into that government conversation, because sometimes it can seem very removed, to government entities that aren't running a business. It's like it just kind of adds specificity and urgency, and I think it's a really important role that we have to make those kind of events happen. We also do a lot of coordination, government wide about space commerce policy issues. One legacy that's unique to the United States is our space capability and governance really developed organically over many decades. And so our authorities and roles are really scattered across multiple organizations. So that means, our office has picked up this kind of old school, ironically, switchboard role where we're really kind of pulling these entities together when it makes sense, and it's a topic that's relevant to what is their slice of that space government's pie, so to speak. And then, broadly with our interagency partners, that's the Department of State, Department of Defense, the Federal Aviation Administration, USGS, or the United States Geological Survey, and other offices within the Department of Commerce, because there's like 13 of them, and the White House. The administration is actually critical. We connect, all of these entities together and businesses, and we also do a lot of work to connect them to their foreign counterparts. So there's a translation effect here, because not every country organizes,
Right.
and so we're constantly kind of reminding everyone, like, okay, here's the set that makes the most sense to talk to for.
You led into my next question, which I really want to, set the framework for the second half of this. Is this, I don't want to call it archaic, but we have had the US in particular has had a very long-standing space industry, right? With parameters and pillars and agencies, and the way that, and that's served us well. I mean, we obviously have a very, booming industry around it, but there also are some challenges and limitations with where the space economy is going and all of these new ways of doing business and new entrants. And one of the things that I always joke sometimes is that it's no longer your grandfather's space industry, right? Because it is rapidly evolving. So when you look across this international landscape and of all of these countries that are engaging in space, to your point about even how governments are set up, just the ecosystems are set up differently in terms of established players and new players and money flow. And how do you think about this evolving landscape to try to normalize space so that these commerce channels and business deals can get done with all of these different variables?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of it's kind of it's a daily effort to play this connecting role and to advocate internally and externally.
Yeah,
So voices like yours, for example, and sort of bringing this topic to ears that wouldn't necessarily think about it, is absolutely important. And so we're very proactive in the sense of making sure that our senior leadership has this on their agenda when they're talking about X, Y, Z. Maybe agriculture is the main point that we're just going
right.
to default to what they know, and space as a newer topic at this level. A lot of people in those mid senior levels just don't have a space background, and so we have this sort of consistent education role to bring that out. But I think there's been tremendous progress even in the past 5 years, where it's now on the agenda, not just for necessarily our longest partners and deepest security relationships, but, for the global South, for Africa, for South America, continuing with India, these are Japan, South Korea. These are all partners that, our conversation is maturing when it comes to space related cooperation and trade. So I guess I say so that role is inward looking, the advocacy role to help US policy and regulation function better, to encourage the private sector to innovate, to grow, to connect. And then outward, trying to encourage the global space sector and, trying to find those opportunities, be it at the IAC or other venues or through these track 1.5s, to help them find, the customers the opportunities to collaborate and cooperate. And it's across that entire spectrum. It doesn't have to fit one particular mold. And again, that's why we're trying to support the environment, because we don't want to dictate to anyone like how it actually manifests. We just want progress, innovation, and things to work better and more efficiently. and to again let the ecosystem grow. And then let me see. I think the other thing I wanted to mention is there is definitely a link between, talk about what is our role. There's a link between what governments do and the growth of a new industry. I mean, there just needs to be some organization, some push that kind of helps a positive feedback loop form that encourages growth in these various sectors. If we're encouraging growth in the space sector, it's not going to be just in isolation. It's not. It can't be a means to itself. It has to, have
Yeah.
that solution in the long run. Or maybe has a lot of these kind of spin-off benefits. That are also useful in the eyes of the government. It's not necessarily that a single company sold X dollars. It's because, like, okay, we've got this economic activity. It's brought money into the community. It's grown our workforce. We're getting these other and advantages. And so that's why there is every government has an interest in kind of supporting this kind of activity, aside from just strictly like the profit, right? And it's same for the U.S. We're that's one of the reasons why we have this sort of mesh network of various institutions that have a connection to technology to encourage.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a systems as systems benefit approach because sometimes it's quantifiable and sometimes it's qualifiable. Like you can just see the ripple effects and it really is it permeates a lot of things. And I also really liked the point that you made about not, dictating the way to do things because I think that that would honestly be a losing battle because every country needs to justify why space is a good investment and it's going to trickle down and mean different things to their population, to their economies, to their culture. So I like the idea of having, I don't want to call it a loose framework, but at least it's some structure to engage with understanding that you're all marching toward, the same goal. And my question is, so we beyond the differences, I want to focus on a lot of similarities or where, some of these collaboration pieces can go. And so understanding that different countries have different structures, are there themes that you've seen that have permeated? So maybe it can be barriers of entry, but I'm more interested in like what are some of the areas that you're seeing cropping up a lot where the main business opportunities exist, where these technologies are ripe and ready for this sort of global collaboration. It's just the environment needs to be ready for them.
Hmm. Oh, that's a really interesting question. What pops into my mind is there's a company in Nigeria that is currently combining satellite broadband. It's called Tizeti. They're using Eutelsat broadband and then they're combining it with sort of Earth-based kind of Wi-Fi and towers to
Hmm.
service communities. And they're doing it in a way that is resulting in it's an actual viable business plan. They're able to operate and maintain their stuff, which is great.
Yeah.
So it's a and I really think that there's room for the U.S. and these sort of newer markets to work together in these combinations to use existing technology plus the advantage of some space-based capabilities that are becoming stronger every day. Like what
Yeah.
can we do with these other kind of increasingly dynamic options that are going to be added to the suite of possible applications that can be blended in different ways to really localize those capabilities. And I did a lot of development work in my past, and maybe I sound a little jaded, but I have definitely had my set of projects where the intention was really good, the money was there, but because they didn't have a business plan,
Right.
because they didn't have a reason or a focus or the manpower or the funding to continue it, and so I really like projects that blend the two that have an enduring capability to it. So, but you asked me like, well, what are the things, the patterns I'm seeing that are sort of the differences in countries, and I'd say there's the market access piece is always a challenge to be balanced, in that if there's access provided in the U.S. market, there's access provided in X other market. There's I think sometimes we have challenges with conflicting regulations that are centered around national security concerns
Yeah.
or intellectual property concerns, and so that's a constant sort of struggle to people are always concerned about those issues and sovereignty, and it's understandable, so.
Yeah.
Uh, the area we have the most opportunity is when there's an unintentional conflict, like we're both trying to do the same thing, but we've interpreted this a little different way. And maybe we can align this, and that is kind of often a conversation we have with, say, for example, European countries, trying to
Mhm.
make it a little easier for us to be able to work together. Um, Culturally, I think risk is a really interesting,
Yeah, risk
where
appetite is very
yeah,
different
yeah, it really,
country-wise,
yeah,
government to investor, I mean, across the board.
yeah, yeah. So, and that's like one of those areas where you can't litigate or register. You can't. I mean, like it takes a conversation. I mean, it takes exposure. It takes some cross pollination of our working populations to overcome some of that. So yeah, hopefully, I don't know. Did I get that? Did I get that answer there?
Well, you did, and I think that the way you answered it is also kind of the right way because there's not really one. Because I think that most people are watching and sort of keeping their finger on the pulse of where the ecosystem is evolving. And the biggest piece that you hit on, which I think is the main question, is people this word of regulation. It's a
Hmm.
scary word for a lot of folks. It doesn't have to be, but I think that to your point, that has been a barrier. And I'm going to give my assessment, and you tell me if I'm correct on this. So
Okay.
going back to the concept of, this isn't your grandfather's space agency anymore. Obviously, there are regulations and parameters and things in place that have propped us up and gotten us to how the whole industry is running. I think that where I'm seeing things going, there's at least a spirit of understanding that things might need to evolve and adapt to allow more of these global collaborations. Am I correct on that? Which I think can be very encouraging because, while as you were talking about these opportunities and trends, I think we're still discovering what those are. And that's why I think that these sort of conversations and a lot of the work you're doing is important because you don't know what you don't know unless you're talking to these countries and companies, then you can really identify what the challenges are and work to correct it, right?
Right. So, I mean, so looking forward,
Yeah.
I imagine many listeners have heard about the White House's work to develop an interagency proposal, and this legislation would essentially allow the Office of Space Commerce and the FAA to fill some gaps in the U.S. government ability to regulate commercial space activities. Um, and as referenced earlier, we have this old legacy system, right? And it focuses on right now, launch, reentry, radio frequencies, and remote sensing, and these sort of like stark categories. But with in space manufacturing, with the biggest activities that are opening up, there's a lot of gaps in how we're dealing with that. And again, this is a problem with, how do we talk to other countries if we don't have aligned categories of things that we're regulating? I mean, like it's really a chicken and the egg problem when we're trying to get our own house in order and figure out how we want to think about it. And meanwhile, we're talking with other countries that are kind of doing it in parallel.
Hmm.
So right now, we do see India doing all sorts of other things, and the U.S. government in general needs to make sure that we can say yes as much as possible to these commercial activities while still protecting, I think, really importantly, the sustainability of space, physical space, so that we can, continue to rely on satellites to do sort of the infrastructure level services they provide every day, and also provide accessible space to be able to experiment and evolve new services and new activities. So this particular legislation depends on Congress. In the meantime, the OSC and our interagency colleagues, we're going to be doing what we can to understand these challenges and opportunities and really kind of, again, to support the development of this new commercial ecosystem.
I'm really happy to hear that because it's evolving quickly. And you mentioned sustainability. I was actually just in Saudi Arabia last week at their space debris conference, and it was talking about obviously sustainability and what the business models are and tech capabilities, but even just the global consequence if we don't develop sustainable systems or protect this space that we're all going to be utilizing collectively much more aggressively and frequently. And we don't know what we don't know yet, right? Because as these technologies are maturing, as these spaces are getting used in new ways, I think the regulatory environment of what space is going to look like in 15 years is going to be very different. But we need the business models, to your point, to set the precedent for the scalability of where it's actually going to build.
Yeah, and so a little context for you here. So the Office of Space Commerce, we absolutely have a regulation role as well. So I've been talking about advocacy for the most of this conversation, and on the regulation side, we have CRISRA, which focuses on that remote sensing piece.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so so to acknowledge that they're responsible for licensing, regulation overseeing U.S. commercial remote sensing and systems in general, and they're tasked with really striking a balance between national concerns, national security concerns, and supporting U.S. commercial capabilities, sort of keeping them as least fettered as possible.
Mm.
Looking to the future, in space regulation, it's possible that we could take on a piece of that portfolio. So we continue that work there. So this is very close to our interest. And the other reason why we're super interested in space sustainability is because we also have an operational role. So space situational awareness and space traffic coordination used to belong to, well, still belongs. It's being transferred from Department of Defense over to Department of Commerce, primarily for the
Oh,
civil.
interesting.
So
Yeah.
we're tracking satellites and supporting safe operations in space. And there's a lot of there's a pressing need for more accurate and timely SSA data. We need to figure out how to share information, and this will be a global public source. I mean, we're a global public good. It's going to be just like spacetrack.org, available, to whoever who wants it, to provide like a baseline level of information to, again, promote space safety, with some room there to allow commercial entities to innovate, to provide bespoke or special services that maybe help satellites be more efficient, in their orbits, or whatever it is they're trying to do that is kind of beyond that like very baseline space like safety level. So
Yeah.
that round of this is called TRACS, the Traffic Coordination System for Space. It should go online by the end of this year, and then it'll be an iterative build, from that point on. But we're really excited about it. We will not turn off spacetrack.org. It's still going to go. We're just building something that will eventually be the.
Yeah, that can be a bit more agile and iterative as things adapt and evolve. We have a question from someone watching that I want to pull in, because when we were talking about some of the themes that you've experienced, and it's an interesting question because you answered it from a business aspect, which you have to. I mean, that's where you're focused. And really, a lot of the answers you gave are very much on these areas where there's a lot of investment, a lot of interest. So looking at utilization of space data, the telecom industry, I mean, that's where the bulk of the money is now, the bulk of the investment too, because that's where there's the quicker ROI. Looking a bit farther out, are you seeing capability needs that are trending? So where space is going, and we talked about, you and I personally have talked about this, but also on the show, like the whole LEO cislunar economy. Are there business ideas that you're seeing permeating that have some real models and legs that are worth mentioning?
It's a great question, but it's my situation is I love all my space industries.
Are there trends,
Exactly,
at least, that you're
yeah.
seeing people really leaning into globally?
Commercial space destinations are really fascinating, and there's a lot of activity and a lot of discussion about what is the combination of companies or countries and purpose that those
Yeah.
are toward. Um, there's a real flowering of activity in LEO in general, and that's also part of the reason why it's so urgent for us to deal with, because we're just putting more and more tonnage every year into those orbits, and we want to make sure that they can continue to do that. So really, Office of Space Commerce is more interested in making sure the field is clear, than necessarily like really drilling down on like what is going to be the big picture opportunity for commerce broadly, So I would defer to some of my commercial colleagues to really pontificate on which one's going to be the winning horse on that.
That's fair. Yeah, I think also to your point earlier about risk, it's also going to take, I think, that environment. I don't want to say to level set, but the risk appetite, especially for building out some of these larger capabilities and structures, that there have been companies that have potentially demonstrated but haven't had the ability to scale because the investment risk is lower, right? The development infrastructure risk of what it's going to look like is just mixed. And so I think that's probably something that maybe in 1 to 2 years is going to look different as well.
Yeah,
What about, yeah, I mean, I would say that for me, I think that the ISAM, just the whole ISAM portfolio within low Earth orbit, so the, in orbit service assembly and manufacturing is really fascinating to me, because we no doubt will get there, especially with a lot of these, commercial LEO destinations, the commercial space stations coming online, and just everything that's going to be enabled to make those operational beyond the launch, but the robotic manufacturing and the in-orbit refueling and just all of the infrastructure development. there's so many companies that are already doing it. It's just the growing and sustaining. So that's where I would sort of hedge my bets, because there's just a lot of growing interest. But the challenge is this sustainment piece. It's not just the debris aspect, but it's also like the technical capabilities to sustain, to manufacture in space. We don't have the conditions to scale that yet. And so I think for me, it's having those conversations about how to get people to not think about space as such a risky bet, because we can stand on the shoulders of these industries and companies that are already doing, and then allow the market to be creative and expand, because we already have this established base. It's that balance between the old state and then the new guard, in a way. You can quote me, maybe don't quote me,
I got,
but yeah, at least that's what I'm starting to see a little bit. But it's going to take a lot of regulation and a lot of coordination, because that framework
yeah.
is
Hmm.
not just one nation, it's global and it's integrative. It's that systems of systems that we talked about. And that is where
Yeah.
you and the government and all of these other global entities are really going to be critical, because the innovation will get there. It's just the coordination, growth, and scaling.
Yeah, and this it's funny because this conversation is almost feels like our track 1.5. We have government and industry in the room together, and we're having this conversation, and you make it, you kind of having those insights and talking about this exact thing of injecting energy into this, giving us focus, giving us reason, to look into particular possible scenarios and what would be the implications of XYZ policy or regulation. So all of that is a very helpful dialogue, and it's exactly what we hope to continue to do. I will say, I see, just totally personally speaking, things I'm excited about. I really, I'm pretty passionate about digital inclusivity and being able to, kind of really reach both, density and just reach it all, particularly the global south. So I think satellites have a real opportunity to be a major game changer, of blending technology to achieve some of those goals. And that really is kind of is a subset of just kind of encouraging countries to blend these space applications with driven by sort of local demands to do something new, and so San Francisco isn't thinking necessarily about Peru's problems, but I'm sure there's a young developer there. I'm sure there's some people there who are trying to like tick away at something, or see or see a demand for something that could translate into commercial service that they could develop, and then you've got something as well to trade. Then maybe the U.S. would be interested. I mean, you sort of joining this market of ideas and this literal market of services and goods, and I think that's full of potential for cooperation and for eventual and for trade.
I completely agree with that, because I think the
Yeah,
future has to be competitive, collaborative, more on the collaborative side, because that's
yeah,
really where we're going to be able to take the best ideas, the best ways of doing business, combine them for our collective wish. Because globally, we all want to access space. I don't want to say we want to achieve the same thing, because that's not true, but we all
yeah.
want to access space and utilize space in different ways, and also not abuse it. And that's
Right.
that's an important concept.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I guess the last part, if you're talking about game changing things, I'm personally interested in the space based solar power and the possibility of that changing our dependence on fossil fuels. And so
Oh yeah.
I follow that. I'm really interested in that, and I'm a cheerleader for our industry and building that capability out and making it real for people.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of really good movement within the Middle East and some other countries that are working on those challenges, and being able, to your point that you made in the beginning, utilize best practices from other industries that are already doing, and just translate them and spin them into space. Yeah. So my last question for you, while I still have you as a captive audience, is, so I appreciate you mentioning personally what you're excited about, and the trends you're seeing in the Office of Space Commerce. If you could give a piece of advice to a company in a country that isn't necessarily engaged in space, what would be the one thing you would tell them?
Solve the non-space problem and work backwards from there. So being because it will unlock financing, unlock advocates, unlock supporters and collaborators if you put it in terms that are real to those people. So if your space thing if it's applicable in agriculture, then look to the agriculture community to support its development and implement it. And you can bring along the space people with you, but if you stay locked in the space room, it's people would think it's a great idea, but I don't know how far you're going to get actually implementing it. Because if you're in the space room, the cool, sexier things tend, I think, get more attention and funding. but the more pragmatic sort of stuff, maybe not as much, you know. So you really have to kind of network and diversify a bit. And if you go to one agriculture community that doesn't take you seriously, then there's probably more than one. You know, just find phase shift over to another set within that piece. And also if you go into the game and you're thinking it's agriculture, but it's not a good fit in the end, and you can also switch. You could keep an open mind about figuring, well, where does this thing land? I'm sure every entrepreneur out there can tell you that it wasn't necessarily a straight line, to go
Oh
from
yeah.
con piece, and it's not any different for space, So blending these applications together in new ways. I tend to be, I'm a little like Earth centric biased just because of my background, but I can absolutely see this conversation, for the sort of new opening world for in space and kind of a little nearer term, the Leo space type of activity.
I think that's a perfect way to end it. I think that your earthbound view though is really critical too, because that's still like 95% of the space economy. And really, if we're going to make space make sense for people, it also needs to make sense for the populace about why we're even investing in it. And there needs to be these
Yeah. Yeah.
tangible, real world touch points. But I love your solving for non-space and even looking at these adjacent industries of, because most technology now is dual use. It's just how you
Yeah.
integrate it and utilize it. And I agree with you. They shouldn't pigeonhole. So that is actually really good advice. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. And I think there's been a lot of really good concept covers, but also hopefully a lot of really good information about how people can engage, you in your office and really engage with the US better. And, so we can build this framework of global engagement as a community.
I absolutely agree. And I guess the other piece I would note is to our various international partners to leverage the U.S. Embassy there, because it's sort of like a mini
Mm,
representation from commerce, from state, from everything under the sun. There's a connection to somebody in that embassy, and so they can also be a good resource to kind of figure out, well, where is my counterpart for the thing
mm.
I want to talk about, and it's true for government, it's true for civil, it's true for commercial. So it's a useful starting point.
Absolutely. Most often people don't know that resources exist or who they can even ask the right question to. So thank you for mentioning that.
And I have to give credit to Civil, so Space Foundation plays an absolute critical role of bringing us together, and
Thank you.
supporting, and from the IAC to Space Symposium to the many events we attend, to the panels you run, and for example, this podcast are super important. So I'm really appreciative that you're making.
No, thank you. And I mean, it works because we have people like you and others that come on and can talk about things. Because truly, my goal, and I know the Space Foundation's goal, is really to just advance the global ecosystem across all facets. And the more that we can demystify and offer products and programs and expertise is really what we're in it for. So I want to thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. And I know it's added a lot of value to me, to our listeners, and to everyone watching. I want to thank you for joining us. And remember that there's a place for everyone in the global space ecosystem. And we'll see you next time.